Well, let's keep talking, shall we, about the challenges ahead for Sir Keir Starmer. The former Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, Jonathan Powell, joins us now from Cornwall. Great to speak to you. Does it remind you of '97?
A bit, yes. I mean, the excitement of a turnover of government in this big fashion. I mean, it's a long time ago. It was a quarter of a century ago. So it was a different country, different world, and of course, a very different person in Keir Starmer. But yes, the joy of actually turfing out a useless government is always pleasant.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was kind of doing my kind of revision ahead of this sort of historic day, watching some of the old broadcast footage. Everyone's talking about bleepers there. You do kind of realise just how much has changed since.
Yeah, we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have mobile phones, and the weather was a lot better too. It's a beautiful May day. We went to go with not this rain.
Yeah, a bit drizzly today, certainly. Keir Starmer might have a Blair-style landslide, but it's not exactly, a vote share landslide to boot. Is there any concern that you have that this is a mandate built out of sand?
No, I don't think it's a problem. This stuff about not the percentage of vote. This is our system. Our system is we don't have proportional representation. If you win the most seats, you get to govern. Tony Blair in his third term only had about 30-odd% of the vote and managed to govern perfectly well. So that's really not a problem. I think a lot of this is very confected. Also, the turnout issue. When you know who's going to win, then people don't turn out. The same was true in '97. The turnout went down because people knew who was going to win. Also, in this case, the Tory vote was much suppressed. So I don't think either of those are valid in terms of saying that he doesn't have a mandate.
What is certainly clear is he's got a majority. He's got the kind of majority that, if you want to, you can be pretty radical with. Tony Blair was said to have commented privately, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this, that he wishes that he'd been radical sooner, that he'd gone further on some of the reforms earlier on. Is that something that you think perhaps Keir Starmer should reflect on?
Yes, I do. I think that you have the maximum political capital when you're elected with a big landslide like this, and the political capital goes down over time. We made some fairly radical changes to start with. We had the independence of the Bank of England, and we had things like Prime Minister's questions, which we abolished the twice a week Prime Minister's questions went to one. But what we didn't do was do the public service reform. We should have been much more radical on that. If we'd done it then when we had the political capital, we could have reaped the benefits later on. So I do think, as far as he has radical measures he wants to introduce, for example, on planning, now's the time to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, because if you speak to Keir Starmer, as I did during the campaign, he says, look, first steps first, and then we can bring in the reforms that we want for the public services. Your advice would be move now, when you've got the mandate, when you've got the power.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he's right that it takes time to gear this stuff up, but you need to give symbols of what you're going to do. So you won't be able to pass legislation on planning before the summer break, but you should announce it and get the political capital behind what you're doing before people can start opposing it. The opposition will be flat on its back for a few months. You've got a chance, as Tony Blair had in '97, to do some really quite radical things early on.
Sue Gray is now wearing the shoes that you once filled. The Chief of Staff role, the most important role in many ways around the Prime Minister. Any advice for her?
I don't think she needs my advice. She was much more senior than I was in '97 inside the civil service. She had much more experience at the centre of government. And it seems to me that they've made a very good start in terms of getting the cabinet appointed much more quickly than we did in '97, in bringing in these expert ministers like Timpson and Patrick Vallance. So far, so good, I would say. I think she's got a very clear grasp of what she's trying to achieve, and she's obviously done the preparatory work.
Fascinating to talk to you. Adam Bolton is here as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Jonathan Powell, on the foreign policy front, we've seen a sort of standard exchange this evening of Starmer and Biden speaking to each other and exchanging tweets saying about the special relationship between our two nations and about working with each other. But it seems to me that there is much more pressing on the foreign policy agenda for this Prime Minister than there was for Tony Blair when he came in, although, of course, 9/11 rather took over his premiership subsequently. Do you see those same pressures, and what do you think that Prime Minister Starmer should do in foreign policy terms over the first weeks where he's got some quite important summits?
I mean, most Prime Ministers come in knowing very little about foreign policy and intending to focus on domestic policy. That's why they got elected. Tony Blair didn't know much about foreign policy. Mrs Thatcher didn't actually know much about foreign policy. But they get baptised in it very fast. In the case of Keir Starmer, it's going to be very fast indeed, because next week he'll be going to Washington for the NATO summit. He'll be having his first bilateral with Joe Biden, meeting other world leaders. The week after, he's hosting all the European leaders here in London. And immediately after the summer, he's going to have to go to the Pacific, to Samoa, for the meeting of Commonwealth heads of government. So he's going to be thrown into the machinery of international affairs straight away. And he also has a whole series of very challenging issues, from Gaza to the Ukraine to relations with China to what's going to happen in the US presidential election. So yes, he's going to have the pressure heaped on much more quickly than Tony Blair did, and he'll have to be ready to deal with it and ready to get the right advice to make progress. Britain's been fairly absent from the international field over the last 14 years, or at least certainly since Brexit, as we've focused internally during that time. And now is going to be Britain being back. He has to put some meat on that and actually demonstrate what we're going to do.
Thank you very much indeed for being on the programme this evening. Really fascinating to talk to you tonight, Jonathan Powell. Thank you.
Thank you.